Chapter 1. The Unseen Invitation. The sky was overcast as Lydia approached the decrepit gates of the asylum, her footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. A chill hung in the air, more oppressive than the cold temperature itself, as though the very atmosphere of the place was thick with the weight of forgotten years. The iron gates loomed ahead, rusted and barely standing, their twisted metal bars resembling the skeletal remains of a long-dead giant. Beyond the gates, the silhouette of the asylum itself stretched into the misty horizon, its looming presence both ancient and oppressive. Lydia had read all the stories, of course, the ones that claimed the place was abandoned, that the asylum had been forgotten after the last patient had died years ago. But there were whispers too, the kind that reached the ears of those who dared to dig deeper, who sought the truth behind the veil of urban legend. Some said that the asylum was never truly abandoned, that it still had residents, ghosts of those who had been forgotten, their souls trapped inside the building for eternity. As Lydia gazed up at the structure, a shiver ran down her spine. She had always been drawn to places like this. Ruins, forgotten histories, the remnants of the past. But this place was different. The weight of its presence was palpable, like something ancient, something sinister, was watching her. The gate creaked open with a sound that seemed to echo from miles away. She hadn't touched it. She hadn't even moved close to it. But it opened anyway, as if the asylum itself was beckoning her inside. Lydia hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, the fog swirling around her feet as she made her way toward the entrance. There was no turning back now. The moment she had crossed the threshold of the gate, the air around her seemed to thicken, pressing in on her from all sides. She took a deep breath and forced herself to move, her footsteps slow and measured on the overgrown path leading up to the asylum. The building seemed to rise taller with every step she took, its walls covered in ivy and decay, its windows dark and lifeless. The closer she got, the more oppressive the feeling became. There was something watching her, something beyond the walls, beyond the windows. She couldn't explain it, but she could feel it, a presence in the air that tugged at her nerves. The front door was open, but just barely. A thin sliver of darkness yawned before her as she stepped inside. The air within was thick with the smell of mildew and rot, a heavy, suffocating stench that made her stomach churn. The entryway stretched far beyond her sight, its long, dark corridors disappearing into shadow. A gust of cold wind swept through the hall, sending a shiver through her bones, but Lydia couldn't bring herself to leave. She had to know. She had to understand what had happened here. She stepped further into the asylum, her breath coming out in shallow gasps as the darkness seemed to close in around her. The silence was deafening. Not even the usual creaks of an old building in disrepair could be heard. The air was too still, too stagnant. It was as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the first move. Lydia's flashlight flickered as she moved deeper into the hallway. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rotting walls and the broken remnants of furniture. Papers were scattered on the floor, yellowed and curling at the edges. Old photographs, some faded beyond recognition, lay scattered across the floor like the remnants of forgotten lives. Each one seemed to tell a story, stories of patients once held here, trapped in the asylum's cruel embrace. Stories of lives that had been lost, but never truly ended. As she walked down the long hallway, Lydia noticed something strange. The silence, oppressive as it was, seemed to be filled with something else. A faint whispering, just on the edge of her hearing. It wasn't clear, not at first, but as she listened, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was a whisper, a soft murmur of something, someone, speaking just out of reach. She paused, her breath hitching in her throat as the whispering grew louder still. It seemed to echo off the walls, bouncing from one dark corner to another. Lydia spun around, but there was no one behind her, no one in front of her, just the same empty hallways stretching on into the abyss. And yet the whispering continued, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, murmuring secrets she couldn't understand. She stepped forward again, the sound of her boots clicking on the cracked tile floor echoing in the silence. The hallway before her seemed to stretch on forever, leading into the dark recesses of the building. A sudden feeling of unease crawled up her spine, urging her to turn back, to leave before it was too late. But Lydia couldn't stop now. She had come too far. As she made her way down the hallway, the whispering intensified, swirling around her like a wind in the dark. It was no longer just a murmur. It was a cacophony of voices, each one speaking in a language she didn't understand. The temperature dropped, and Lydia could see her breath cloud in front of her, hanging in the air like smoke. A door appeared ahead, its frame barely visible in the dim light. It was ajar, a faint light flickering from within. Lydia moved toward it, drawn by the eerie glow. As she reached out to push the door open, something stopped her. A sudden, sharp pain in her chest, as if an invisible hand had gripped her heart. She stumbled back, gasping for air, the whispers growing louder, now a frenzied chorus of indistinct voices. She felt the temperature drop even further, her skin prickling as if she were being watched. She could hear footsteps, faint but unmistakable, approaching from behind. She wasn't alone. Panic rose in her chest, but before she could react, the door slammed open with a deafening crash, revealing nothing but pure blackness inside. A voice, low and guttural, suddenly filled the air, speaking a single, chilling word. "Welcome." The darkness inside the room seemed to swallow her, pulling her in as if it had been waiting for her arrival all along. Chapter 2. Whispers Through the Walls. Lydia stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest as the door to the blackened room swung open before her. The echo of the sudden crash reverberated through the asylum, but in the eerie silence that followed, it felt as though the building itself had stopped breathing, waiting for her next move. The room beyond was a void, an inky blackness that seemed to draw the very light from her flashlight, leaving only the vague outline of a cold, empty space. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she stood frozen at the threshold, torn between curiosity and the primal instinct to flee. Her feet felt as if they were glued to the floor, but the whispers, now louder and more urgent, pushed her forward. They wrapped around her, slipping into her ears like a melody she couldn't escape. Words? Phrases? She couldn't make them out, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, angry, desperate. She reached out for the door frame, her hand trembling as it brushed against the splintered wood. The instant her fingers touched it, the room seemed to pulse, as though some ancient force had awoken within the asylum's decaying walls. The temperature dropped even further, the cold biting into her skin as a shiver ran through her body. Something was watching her, something that had been waiting for her to find it. With an almost imperceptible tremor in her chest, Lydia stepped over the threshold, her boots making the faintest of noises as they hit the ground. The moment she crossed the line, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the entire building. The room plunged into total darkness, and Lydia's breath hitched. She fumbled for her flashlight, fingers trembling as they gripped the cold metal of the beam. The light flickered once, twice, then steadied, revealing a sight that nearly made her heart stop. The room was not empty. It was filled with old furniture, chairs overturned, tables broken, papers strewn across the floor, everything left behind in haste, as though the people who had once occupied the room had fled in terror. The walls were covered in peeling paint, revealing layers of grime and decay beneath. But what caught her attention more than anything were the walls themselves. Marks, etched into the plaster, faint but unmistakable. Scratches. Scratches that ran in every direction, crisscrossing the walls, some so deep they seemed to tear at the very surface of the asylum's bones. Lydia stepped closer, her eyes narrowing in the dim light. The scratches were strange, irregular, as if made by desperate hands. She could see patterns, symbols, almost hidden within the random chaos. But before she could examine them further, a cold gust of air swept through the room, carrying with it a scent. It was a sickly sweet odor, like decayed flowers or rotting fruit, and it made Lydia's stomach turn. She turned sharply, her flashlight beam darting across the room, but there was nothing. The room was still, save for the slight movement of the air. She pressed her hand to her mouth, willing herself to stay calm, but the whispers, those whispers, seemed to have followed her into the room. They were growing louder, more distinct now, as if they were coming from within the walls themselves. Suddenly, the floor beneath her creaked, the wood groaning as though something heavy had shifted. Lydia froze, her breath caught in her throat. The whispers stopped for a moment, a deafening silence taking their place, but then the sound returned, closer this time, as though it was circling around her. Slowly, she turned in place, her heart racing, but all she could see were the familiar disarray of chairs and broken objects. Nothing moved. No one was there. She didn't know what to do. She needed answers. She needed to understand what was happening to her. Then, just as quickly as the silence had descended, the whispers came again. But this time, they were clearer. They were calling her name. Lydia. The sound was soft, but unmistakable. Her name. It echoed through the room, reverberating off the walls, bouncing back to her from every direction. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as the sound washed over her, sending a jolt of panic straight to her core. She spun around, but there was no one. No figure in the corner, no shadow lurking in the dark. Lydia. The voice came again, this time closer, too close. Her flashlight flickered, casting brief shadows across the room. And then, just as suddenly as the whispers had started, they stopped. Complete silence, broken only by her own shaky breathing. Lydia's hands were trembling now, sweat beading on her forehead as she fought to steady herself. She could feel her heart thumping in her chest, too loud, too fast. She needed to get out. She needed to leave, but something held her in place, a force far stronger than her fear. It was as if the room itself had locked her in, as if the walls were closing in on her, pushing her deeper into its clutches. Without thinking, she turned toward the door, only to find it gone. The place where the door had been was now just solid wall, the plaster smooth and untouched, as if the door had never existed at all. Panic surged within her as she rushed forward, pressing her hands against the cold, unyielding surface, but it wouldn't give. The walls seemed to mock her, silent and impenetrable. Lydia backed away, her pulse pounding in her ears as she searched the room for another exit. A window, a hole, anything. But there was nothing. No way out. The temperature had dropped again. The air felt dense, almost suffocating. And then, she noticed it. A shape, dark and indistinct, moving across the far corner of the room. It was there, but only for a fraction of a second, slipping out of view before she could focus on it. She wasn't alone. Lydia's breath quickened as she spun around, her flashlight desperately searching the shadows. But the room remained empty, save for the unsettling stillness. And then, in the dead silence, a soft voice whispered again. This time not from the walls, but from directly behind her. Leave, while you still can. The voice was cold, emotionless. But the words, they were unmistakable. Lydia whipped around. her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. But once again, there was nothing there. No one. But as her gaze drifted to the floor, she saw something new. Something that hadn't been there before. A trail of dark, sticky substance leading away from her toward the far corner of the room. A trail of blood, and it was still wet. Chapter 3. The Silent Halls. Lydia's fingers tightened around the flashlight as she stared at the trail of blood stretching across the cold, cracked floor. The wetness glistened in the beam of light, reflecting back at her with an unnatural sheen, as though it was more than just blood. It almost seemed to shimmer, alive, hungry, waiting for something. Her stomach churned, but she forced herself to look away, focusing instead on the space ahead of her. The whispers had stopped. The room, once thick with their urgent murmurs, was now suffocatingly still. The only sound was the rhythmic thumping of her heartbeat, pounding so loudly in her ears that it almost drowned out the soft, unsettling creaks of the building. She had to keep moving. The walls seemed to close in on her, pressing down with a weight that grew heavier the longer she stood still. She stepped carefully over the blood, her eyes never leaving it, as though it might reach up and pull her into its depths if she wasn't cautious. The trail led toward a darkened hallway, its entrance yawning open like the maw of some great beast. There was a faint light at the far end of the corridor, but it did little to dispel the shadows that clung to the walls. Lydia hesitated only for a moment before she forced herself to move, her steps echoing loudly in the silence. The hall stretched before her, endless and oppressive. The floor was covered in thick layers of dust, the once white tiles now yellowed with age and neglect. Cobwebs clung to the corners, their strands swaying gently as if stirred by an invisible wind. The air smelled of mildew, of something ancient and decayed, but it was the silence that struck her the most. The silence was not natural. It was too absolute, too heavy. It was as though the building itself had taken a vow of silence, as though it was waiting, listening, for something to happen. As she walked down the hallway, Lydia felt the distinct sensation of being watched. It wasn't a fleeting feeling, a trick of the mind. No, it was a presence. Something tangible, something that hovered just out of sight, waiting for her to turn around, to acknowledge it. She forced herself to keep her gaze straight ahead, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but the feeling never left her. The walls were lined with doors, most of them partially open, some hanging from their hinges. She dared not glance into the rooms as she passed them, though a flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye made her pulse spike. She couldn't tell if it was a shadow, a reflection, or something else entirely, but it was there, just long enough to make her doubt her senses. The air grew heavier with each step, and the deeper she went into the asylum, the more oppressive it became. Then, she heard it, a faint sound, like the scraping of nails across the floor. It was so quiet at first that Lydia thought she might have imagined it, but it came again, closer this time. Her heart leapt in her chest, and she spun around, raising her flashlight, its beam cutting through the hallway. Nothing. Her breath came faster now, ragged and uneven, as she realized she had stopped walking altogether. The sound was gone, replaced by the thumping of her own heartbeat in her ears. She took a step back, then another, her eyes scanning the darkness, desperately searching for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just the endless stretch of hallway, empty and silent. But Lydia knew she wasn't alone. The sound had come from the right. A door at the far end of the corridor stood slightly ajar, a faint light flickering within. The scraping noise had emanated from that room. She wasn't sure why she felt the sudden compulsion to go toward it, but the pull was undeniable. It was as though the room had called to her, silently demanding her attention, urging her forward into its depths. She took a slow, hesitant step toward the door, her her flashlight beam trembling in her hand. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, as though the asylum itself was amplifying her every movement. When she reached the door, she paused, her breath held tight in her chest. The light inside the room flickered erratically, casting strange, shifting shadows that danced on the walls like wraiths. Lydia reached out, her hand trembling as she pushed the door open just a little wider. The hinges groaned in protest, but the door gave way, revealing a room that looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. The floor was littered with old furniture. An overturned chair, a broken dresser, papers scattered across the floor, their edges yellowed with age. But what caught her attention were the walls. They were covered, completely covered, with strange symbols drawn hastily with what appeared to be charcoal or blood. Some of the symbols were crude, others intricate, with lines and shapes that seemed to form a pattern, though Lydia couldn't make sense of it. Her gaze traced one of the symbols, and for the briefest moment, she swore it moved. She blinked rapidly, trying to dismiss the thought, but the sensation lingered in her mind, like the weight of something pressing down on her. The room was oppressively silent, save for the occasional flicker of the dim light overhead. She stepped further into the room, her boots making soft thuds on the dust-covered floor. As she passed a small desk, her eyes caught sight of something unexpected, a photograph. The edges were curled, the image faded, but it was unmistakable. It was a picture of the asylum, but it was not a photo from any time recently. The walls in the photo were freshly painted, the furniture well-maintained, the hallways clean. It was an image from a time before the decay, before the rot had set in, before it had become this. Lydia crouched down to pick up the photograph, but as her fingers touched the edge, a sudden, sharp pain shot through her hand. She recoiled, gasping in shock as she pulled her hand away. The flash of pain was brief, but intense, as though something or someone had gripped her hand tightly, digging invisible nails into her skin. She looked at her hand, expecting to see blood or some mark, but there was nothing. No wound, no injury, just the sensation of something cold, something unseen. Her pulse quickened as she rose to her feet, the air around her growing thicker, more oppressive. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the pain faded. But the whispering started again. This time, it wasn't in the walls. It was in her mind. The voices swirled inside her skull, speaking in an unintelligible language. She could feel them, dark, jagged thoughts cutting through her own, overwhelming her senses. They were not the gentle murmurs she had heard before. No, this was something far darker, something ancient and twisted. Leave. Leave before it's too late. The words, though not spoken aloud, seemed to come from every corner of the room, each one making her skin crawl. She spun around, desperate to find the source, but there was nothing. Just the same crumbling room, the same flickering light. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Lydia froze, her heart pounding in her chest as the temperature in the room dropped. A faint mist began to rise from the floor, curling around her ankles like the fingers of something reaching up from the depths. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled the room with a cacophony of voices. They were no longer just words. They were demands. Please. Threats. Her eyes darted to the window, but the glass was clouded, the outside world obscured by thick layers of grime. The air was suffocating, pressing down on her as if the very building itself was closing in, holding her in its grasp. Lydia turned back to the door. The faint light from the hallway spilled under the frame, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her, eager to pull her back into the dark. She had to leave, but the door wouldn't open. And then, she heard it. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable, coming closer from the hallway. Chapter 4. echoes of forgotten screams. Lydia's breath came in shallow gasps, her heart racing in her chest. The door refused to open. She tugged at the handle again, her fingers slipping against the cold metal, but it was no use. The door was sealed shut, as though some invisible force had locked it from the other side. She glanced nervously toward the window, hoping to find some way out, but it was as cloudy and opaque as ever. Her pulse quickened. The mist on the floor had thickened, its tendrils curling around her legs, and the temperature had dropped even further, biting at her skin like an unseen hand. She turned her back to the door, her eyes scanning the room for anything that might offer an escape, though she knew deep down that there was no escape. Not from this place. Not from whatever was watching her. The flickering light overhead sputtered once more, casting a stuttering glow over the room. The shadows it created were unnatural, stretching in strange, impossible directions. Lydia's gaze flickered toward the corner of the room where the shadows seemed to thicken, gathering like a gathering storm. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure there, lurking just at the edge of the light, a shape that was too tall, too thin, and moved just a little too fast to be real. She blinked rapidly, dismissing the thought. Her mind was playing tricks on her, but the feeling in the room, the oppressive, suffocating presence, remained. She could feel it pressing against her, suffocating her. The whispers grew louder again, circling around her like 1,000 unseen voices, all speaking at once. The words were distorted, unintelligible, but there was an undercurrent of urgency to them, an almost desperate tone. She strained her ears, trying to make sense of it, but the moment she focused on one whisper, another one would overtake it, drowning it out. The voices sounded as though they were coming from all around her, from inside her own mind, and from the walls themselves. She shook her head, desperate to clear the noise from her thoughts. It was maddening, the constant murmur, the feeling of being surrounded by eyes that she couldn't see but could feel. Her hands still gripped the flashlight, though it had become a lifeline rather than a tool. She swung it in wide arcs around the room, its beam trembling in her hand as if it, too, were afraid of the darkness. The corners of the room seemed to bend and warp as she turned, her mind refusing to accept what it was seeing. She had to get out. She had to find a way to escape. But the walls felt like they were closing in on her, their edges pressing in with each passing second. Her gaze snapped back to the door. She had to force it open. There was no other option. Lydia stepped toward the door, but something stopped her. A presence, thick and heavy, like a hand on her chest. It was as if the air had thickened, solidified into something more tangible, something far colder. She tried to take another step, but the weight of the atmosphere pressed against her, forcing her to stumble back. And then, a sound. A soft creak. It was coming from the farthest corner of the room, where the shadows were thickest. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, a trick of the flickering light, but then she saw it. Movement. A figure. A shape. Shifting and twisting in the dark. It was long, slender, and humanoid, but not quite human. The way it moved, its limbs stretching and jerking at odd angles, was wrong. Too wrong. The figure straightened, and Lydia froze, her heart nearly leaping out of her chest. The shape had eyes, wide, round, and impossibly black, as though they consumed the light around them. There was no expression in those eyes, no recognition, just a void, an endless, suffocating void. She couldn't look away. Her breath hitched as the figure took a step forward, the sound of its feet scraping against the floor a soft but distinct echo in the silence. It was slow, deliberate, as though it was savoring the moment, enjoying her fear. The shadows seemed to grow longer with each step it took, stretching toward her like hands reaching out from the void. Lydia stumbled back, her feet tripping over the debris on the floor. She hit the edge of the desk with a sharp cry, but she didn't dare to take her eyes off the figure. The flashlight in her hand wavered, casting erratic beams of light across the room, but it couldn't pierce the dark, couldn't break the hold that the figure had over her. The whispers around her grew louder, more frantic, urging her to run, to escape. But her body was frozen in place, her feet glued to the ground. The figure moved closer. Its limbs twisted and contorted as it approached, its long fingers scraping against the floor with an almost sickening sound. Lydia's heart pounded, each beat like a drum in her ears. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick with terror, suffocating her, and all she could do was watch as the figure grew closer, its eyes never leaving hers. And then it stopped. Lydia couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't tear her gaze away from the blackness that consumed its eyes. She felt the pressure on her chest increase, as though the room itself was tightening around her, pressing in on her lungs. Her body was frozen, her heart beating so loudly in her ears that she thought it might burst. Every inch of her screamed to flee, to run, but her body betrayed her, paralyzed by the presence before her. For a long, agonizing moment, the figure stood still, staring at her. Then, it tilted its head slightly, as though studying her, and the silence in the room deepened. The faint, distant scraping noise resumed, but it was closer now, right behind her. She could feel it, the weight of those unseen eyes, pressing into her back, filling her with an icy dread. The figure moved again. This time, it reached out, one of its long, unnaturally long arms extending toward her, its fingers stretching to an impossible length. Lydia's breath caught in her throat, her entire body trembling with fear, and she was certain that if it touched her, if those fingers made contact, she would be consumed, swallowed whole by whatever it was. But then, just as its fingers were a breath away from her face, the light overhead flickered once more. The figure faltered, its movements jerking, its eyes narrowing, as if it had sensed something. The air in the room grew even colder, the mist thickening, swirling around her ankles in dense, suffocating clouds. The whispers started again, but they were different this time. They weren't in her mind anymore. They were in the room, pressing against her skin. Each one a word, a command, a threat. The figure stopped. It was gone, just like that. In the blink of an eye, the presence vanished, leaving nothing but the cold, empty air and the oppressive weight that lingered in its place. Lydia stood there, trembling, staring at the empty corner of the room where the figure had been. She didn't dare move, didn't dare to breathe. Her hand was still clenched around the flashlight, but it no longer seemed to matter. The light was fading, the beam growing weaker, as though it, too, was afraid of the darkness that surrounded them. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream, to flee from this nightmare, but her body refused to obey. Instead, all she could do was stand there, trapped, as the room closed in around her, and the eyes watched. Chapter 5: The Unopened Door. Lydia's body refused to cooperate, each movement stiff and jerky as if her limbs were made of stone. The room, still cloaked in suffocating shadows, seemed to close in on her, each corner darker than the last. The whispering had stopped, but the presence, the thing that watched her, was still there, lingering just beyond the edges of her perception. It was a weight in the air, a suffocating pressure that clung to her skin, to her very soul. The silence was thick, unnatural, and it gnawed at her, making every second feel like an eternity. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. With each passing second, the atmosphere in the room seemed to grow heavier, pressing in on her chest, her ribs, until it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. Her mind screamed for her to move, to run, but every muscle was frozen. unwilling or unable to obey. It was as if some unseen hand had wrapped itself around her, keeping her locked in place, suspended in terror. She tried to blink, tried to clear her thoughts, but the image of those dark, empty eyes haunted her. The figure, whatever it had been, was gone, but it had left something behind, something that clung to her like a shadow. She could still feel its gaze on her, could still sense it lurking just beyond the reach of her awareness. Lydia swallowed hard, forcing herself to take a slow, shallow breath. She wasn't sure how long she had been standing there, trapped in the suffocating grip of her fear. Time seemed to lose meaning in this place. Every second stretched into infinity, each moment dragging on with agonizing slowness. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, sending a chill through her that stole the breath from her lungs. The mist that had been swirling around her feet thickened, creeping up her legs, winding around her like cold, twisting fingers. She could feel it, the coldness, seeping into her bones, chilling her from the inside out. Her teeth began to chatter uncontrollably, and her breath came in short, sharp gasps. It was the cold, the horrible, biting cold that numbed her fingers, her toes, until she couldn't feel them at all. It crept deeper, gnawing at her flesh, a frozen gnawing that crawled under her skin, into her veins, freezing her very soul. And then the whispering returned. It was faint at first, just a murmur, barely audible over the pounding of her heart. But it grew louder, clearer, more distinct. The words, still garbled, distorted, seemed to swirl around her, echoing off the walls, seeping into her mind. She couldn't understand them. They didn't make sense. But the tone of the voices was unmistakable. It was urgent. It was pleading. Run. The word pierced her mind like a knife, sharp and clear, and the terror that had been gnawing at her throat reached a fever pitch. Her body trembled violently, and for the first time since she had entered the asylum, she felt the irresistible urge to flee. She needed to run. She needed to get out, to escape whatever had trapped her in this nightmarish place. But where? How? Her mind was reeling, her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. She had no idea how she had even gotten here, no memory of how she had ended up in this godforsaken asylum. She had no memory of what happened before she arrived. And yet, something was pulling at her. There was a nagging feeling in the back of her mind, an instinct telling her that she needed to find something important, something that could explain all of this. Lydia's legs finally obeyed her, moving instinctively toward the hallway, toward the narrow passage she had come from earlier. Her steps were unsteady at first, but the more she moved, the more her body seemed to remember how to function. The cold still clung to her, and the mist still swirled around her ankles, but her legs carried her forward with increasing speed, as though someone, was pushing her onward. The hallway stretched before her, impossibly long, the walls narrowing with each step, the darkness swallowing her whole. The flickering lights overhead buzzed intermittently, casting erratic shadows along the cracked and peeling walls. The air was thick, stifling, and Lydia could feel the weight of it pressing against her chest. Every step she took felt like wading through thick mud, her feet dragging against the floor as if the ground itself wanted to hold her in place. And then, just as she thought she might escape, she heard it. The sound that froze her blood and made her heart stop dead in her chest. A door creaked open somewhere behind her. Slowly, almost deliberately, Lydia's breath hitched, her legs locking in place as panic shot through her veins. She couldn't look. She couldn't bear to look. Every instinct in her screamed at her to run, to keep moving, but her eyes betrayed her, flicking over her shoulder, drawn to the sound like a moth to a flame. A door, opening, but there was nothing there. No one, just the empty hallway, stretching endlessly behind her. Her chest tightened as the door creaked shut again, the sound lingering in the air like an unanswered question. She didn't know what to think, what to feel. Her mind was spinning, grasping for something to make sense of it all, but it was impossible. There was no explanation for what was happening, no logical answer. Just this maddening, terrifying experience that had no clear beginning or end. The whispers grew louder now, more insistent, their frantic tones sending waves of dread crashing over her. She felt the urge to turn around, to face the thing that had opened the door, but every fiber of her being screamed against it. The last time she had faced it, it had nearly consumed her. It had nearly taken her. Lydia forced her legs to move again, her feet dragging as she hurried down the hallway, her breath quick and ragged. She had to get out of here. She had to escape before whatever was in this place caught up to her. But as she rounded the corner, something changed. The hallway. It was different now. The walls were closer. The floor seemed uneven. The air smelled heavier, fouler. It was as if she had walked into a different dimension entirely, one that twisted the space around her into something unrecognizable. And then, the footsteps started. Soft, measured steps, echoing through the hall. They were slow at first, but they grew louder, closer, until it felt as though someone, or something, was right behind her, stalking her every move. Lydia's heart raced as she spun around, her eyes frantically searching for the source of the sound. There was nothing, no one, but the footsteps continued. Her mind reeled, struggling to comprehend what was happening. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest, the sound of those footsteps growing louder with each passing second. They were getting closer, closer, and then, just as she thought she might snap under the pressure, she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the flickering light, a figure stood. It was tall, thin, and impossibly still. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its body was unnervingly rigid, as though it had been frozen in place for a century. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over its bones. But it was the eyes, those wide, empty eyes, that terrified her. They were staring directly at her, unblinking, as though it could see into her very soul. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as she tried to turn and run, but her legs felt like lead. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She was trapped. The figure took one slow, deliberate step forward, and Lydia screamed, but no sound came. Chapter 6. Beneath the Ashen Floor. Lydia's scream died in her throat as the figure slowly advanced toward her, its pale, translucent skin almost glowing under the flickering lights of the hallway. The air felt suffocating, thick with the weight of its presence. She stood frozen, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps, her body trembling uncontrollably. She couldn't move. She couldn't look away from the figure that seemed to hold her in place with an invisible force. It took another step, and then another. Each movement was deliberate, slow, as if it were savoring her terror. Its head tilted further to the side, the bones in its neck creaking with a sound that made Lydia's skin crawl. She felt an overwhelming urge to scream again, to run, to do anything to escape the suffocating grip of fear that held her in place. But her voice betrayed her. No sound would come. Her eyes darted around the hallway, desperate for an escape. But there was nothing. The walls were closing in. The flickering lights overhead cast long, twisting shadows that seemed to twist and writhe like living creatures. The hallway stretched on, longer than she remembered. An endless tunnel that seemed to bend and twist with every step she took. The doors on either side of her were all closed, sealed tight, their windows obscured by grime and dust. There was no escape. The figure was still coming, its steps growing louder, echoing off the walls like the ticking of a clock. counting down the seconds until it would be upon her. Lydia's chest constricted, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears that it almost drowned out the sound of the footsteps. She could hear the air moving around her, as if the very atmosphere was being warped by the presence of whatever this thing was. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to escape this nightmare. She needed to do something, anything. She had to fight, to run, to break free of this suffocating grip. But the fear had already settled into her bones, freezing her in place. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, and her arms hung uselessly at her sides. There was no strength left in her. The figure was almost upon her now, its hollow eyes fixed firmly on her, unblinking. She could feel its gaze like a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She had the strangest sensation that it wasn't just looking at her. It was looking through her, into something deeper, something beyond the surface. It was as if it could see every secret she held, every fear, every guilt, every regret. And then, without warning, the figure stopped, right in front of her. Lydia's body screamed for her to move, to run, to do anything to escape the oppressive stillness that had descended on the hallway, but she remained frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The figure stood motionless, just a few feet away, its unnatural stillness almost worse than the slow, deliberate advance it had made. There was something wrong with its eyes. They were too wide, too empty, like dark pools of void, sucking in the dim light around them. She couldn't look away from them. She didn't want to look away from them. It was as if they were holding her captive, preventing her from moving, from escaping. Then the whispering started again. It was faint at first, just a murmur, like wind through the trees. But it grew louder, clearer, until it felt like the very walls of the asylum were reverberating with the sound. The voices, there were so many of them now, seemed to come from every direction, swirling around her in a frenzy. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Frantic, desperate, pleading, run, escape. Lydia's breath hitched as the voices grew louder, more insistent, urging her to flee, to break free from whatever trap had ensnared her. But she couldn't. Her legs refused to move, her arms still useless by her sides. She was trapped in this hellish moment, caught between the thing before her and the unseen forces that pressed in on her from every side. The figure's head tilted further, and Lydia felt a jolt of fear race through her. Its mouth opened, wide, impossibly wide, too wide for a human mouth, and from within came a sound that made her blood run cold. A low, guttural growl. The sound rattled her bones, reverberating through her chest like a distant drumbeat. The air grew heavier, thicker with each passing second, and Lydia felt as though she were being suffocated by the very atmosphere. The growl was deep, primal, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth itself. And then it stopped. The hallway fell into an unnatural silence, the only sound the rapid beating of Lydia's heart in her chest. She felt dizzy, disoriented, like the ground beneath her feet was shifting. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching her with its hollow eyes. Lydia's mind was spinning. She couldn't make sense of what was happening. None of this made sense. Her chest tightened with panic, her throat constricting as if the very air were being sucked out of her. She could feel it now, something tugging at her mind, something reaching out from the shadows, pulling at her thoughts, her very consciousness. And then, suddenly, the lights went out. Complete darkness. For a moment, Lydia was suspended in nothingness, her eyes straining to adjust to the absence of light, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Her heart was racing now, pounding against her ribcage as she stood frozen in the dark, her every sense alert, waiting for the inevitable. Then the whispering returned. It was louder now, deafening, a chorus of voices that screamed in agony and desperation. The sound was overwhelming, like a tidal wave crashing against her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. It was everywhere, surrounding her, pressing in from all sides, and Lydia felt herself being pulled into the chaos, losing herself in the maelstrom of voices. Her body jerked forward as if propelled by some unseen force, her feet moving faster than her mind could process. She stumbled, her legs weak and unsteady beneath her, but she kept moving, running blindly through the darkness. She had to escape. She had to get away from this place. But it was no use. No matter how fast she ran, the hallway stretched on endlessly, the doors all sealed tight, the walls closing in around her. The darkness was suffocating, the whispering growing louder, more frantic, until it filled her mind completely. And then, as if to prove there was no escape, Lydia heard it. A door creaked open behind her. Slowly, deliberately. She didn't dare turn around, but the sound was unmistakable. She could feel it, feel the presence behind her growing stronger, more insistent. She was being followed. It was coming for her, and there was nowhere to hide. Lydia's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the cold, unforgiving floor. Her breath came in ragged sobs, her vision blurry, her body trembling uncontrollably as the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, suffocating her in its cold, clammy embrace. She didn't know how much longer she could endure this. She didn't know how much longer she could keep running from the horrors that stalked her in this forsaken asylum. But she had no choice. The darkness was closing in, and Lydia was running out of time. Chapter 7. The Haunting Footsteps. Lydia awoke to an eerie silence that filled the cold, damp air. The darkness around her pressed down with an almost suffocating weight, but for the first time since entering the asylum, she didn't hear the whispering voices. The silence was so profound, it felt unnatural, wrong. It gnawed at her, scraping against the edges of her sanity like fingernails on glass. She wasn't sure how long she had been lying there, curled up on the floor in that narrow hallway, her body stiff and aching. Her clothes were soaked with cold sweat, and her skin was clammy and damp, but the air was still and stagnant, thick with the stale scent of mildew and decay. It smelled like time had stopped here, like the walls had absorbed every memory of pain, fear, and despair that had ever echoed through these halls. Lydia's mind felt foggy, disconnected, as though she were drowning in the abyss of the asylum itself. Every breath she took seemed to echo too loudly in her ears, each sound magnified in the oppressive stillness. Her fingers trembled as she pushed herself up, her legs unsteady as she forced herself to her feet. The darkness seemed to close in tighter, as if the walls were moving closer, encroaching upon her with every step she took. The hallway stretched out before her, a shadowy tunnel leading to an unknown destination, and still the silence remained. Lydia's heart thudded painfully in her chest, a steady drumbeat that seemed too loud in the stillness. She felt a chill creep up her spine, an icy finger tracing along her back as she reluctantly stepped forward. The corridor seemed endless, its walls stretching into infinity, a labyrinth of decaying plaster and rusted metal doors. There was no warmth here, no life, only the endless shadows and the suffocating stillness that pressed down on her with every step. She couldn't remember how she had gotten here or what had happened before, only that she was trapped in this forsaken place, with no way out. As she moved down the hall, her mind scrambled for something, anything that could make sense of her situation. But the more she tried to think, the more her thoughts became muddled, swirling in a frenzy of confusion and fear. It was as though the very air around her was warping her perception, bending her thoughts into something foreign and alien. The shadows in the corners of her vision seemed to dance, flickering and shifting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. She could feel them watching her, feel their eyes on her even when she couldn't see them. It was as though the asylum itself was alive, its walls pulsating with an unnatural rhythm, each heartbeat reverberating through the space like a whisper in her mind. She stopped suddenly, a sense of dread gnawing at her stomach, as though the very act of moving forward was somehow wrong. She glanced to her left, where the faintest sliver of light seemed to be filtering through the cracks in a door. Her eyes locked onto it, and for a moment, she couldn't look away. Something about that small sliver of light felt important. She needed to reach it. She needed to know what was behind that door. The faint glow was barely enough to illuminate the jagged edges of the door frame, but it was enough. Enough to pull her closer, enough to tempt her to step into the unknown. She reached for the handle, her hand trembling as she grasped it, and for the briefest moment, she hesitated. It felt wrong, but then again, everything felt wrong here. What was one more wrong choice in a place where nothing made sense? She twisted the handle and pushed the door open. The hinges screamed as they moved, a sharp, discordant noise that made her flinch. But the door creaked open to reveal nothing, or at least, nothing Lydia could see. There was nothing but darkness within, a suffocating blackness that seemed to swallow the light. Her pulse quickened as she stood there, unable to tear her eyes away from the abyss that lay before her. She couldn't make sense of it, couldn't explain the sensation that washed over her. A feeling of something watching her, waiting, and then it came. A scream. At first, it was so faint that Lydia thought it was a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by the terror that had gripped her for so long. But then the scream grew louder, shriller, until it became a wailing shriek that rattled her bones. It wasn't just one scream. It was a chorus of voices, each one distinct, each one twisted and tortured, blending together in a cacophony of despair. Lydia recoiled, her breath catching in her throat as the sound echoed down the hallway, bouncing off the walls and reverberating in her skull. The voices were screaming at her, screaming for help, screaming for mercy, but there was no escape. The walls of the asylum seemed to close in on her once again, their oppressive weight crushing down on her chest. She turned away from the door, her heart racing, and stumbled backward. The walls were closing in faster now, the space around her shrinking with every second. The light from the open door seemed to dim, the darkness creeping closer, pulling at her very soul. The floor beneath her feet seemed to tremble, and a distant thudding sound echoed from somewhere far away. Lydia's head whipped around, searching for the source of the noise. But there was nothing, just the same endless corridor, stretching out before her like a twisted nightmare that she couldn't escape. Then, from behind her, she heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone or something was following her. Her breath caught in her throat, and her body froze, caught in a moment of sheer terror. She didn't dare look behind her, didn't want to see what was coming, but she couldn't stop herself. Her eyes drifted to the shadows, and there, just at the edge of her vision, she saw it. A figure, a dark silhouette standing at the end of the hallway, its shape distorted and warped by the shadows around it. Lydia's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she tried to make out the details, but the figure remained shrouded in darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, waiting. Her legs shook, her mind screaming for her to run, but her body betrayed her, locking her in place. The footsteps grew louder, closer now, and the figure in the distance began to take shape, its outline becoming clearer, more defined. It was tall, impossibly tall, its long limbs stretching out of proportion. The head was too large, too misshapen, its eyes hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck the light from the world. The thing was no longer standing still. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, closer to her. Her heart raced, each beat a drum in her ears, and her feet finally moved, propelled by fear, by instinct. She ran, not knowing where she was going, not knowing how to escape. Her breath was ragged, her chest tight as the figure followed her, its footsteps echoing with every step. The walls closed in even tighter, the hallway now a maze of shifting, contorted corridors, each turn leading to nowhere. Lydia didn't know how much longer she could keep running. She could feel it closing in, the thing behind her, relentless in its pursuit. And then, without warning, the floor beneath her feet buckled, throwing her off balance. She tumbled to the ground, her head hitting the cold stone floor with a sickening crack. Everything went black. Chapter 8: Shadows That Follow. Lydia awoke to the taste of dust on her tongue and the overwhelming smell of decay. She was lying on the cold, hard ground, her body aching as if it had been twisted and torn in every direction. The sharp, metallic scent of blood lingered in the air, but it wasn't hers. She couldn't move at first, her muscles stiff, her head spinning in a haze that made it impossible to focus on anything. For a long moment, she could do nothing but lie still, her breath shallow, her mind struggling to grasp the reality of where she was. The darkness was so complete that it felt as though it had mass, pressing down on her with a weight she could not escape. Her eyes fluttered open, though the blackness around her remained unyielding. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness overwhelmed her, sending her crashing back to the cold stone floor. There was something wrong with the air, something oppressive that made it hard to breathe, as though it had been thickened by something ancient, something sinister. Slowly, she managed to steady her breathing. She forced herself to sit up again, her movements careful, every joint in her body protesting the effort. When she finally opened her eyes again, she noticed the first thing that made her heart race. The walls were different. They had been smooth, whitewashed, unremarkable before. Now, they were covered in grime and mildew, warped and buckling in places. But it wasn't just the decay that struck her. No, it was the eyes. Hundreds of them. Tiny, glassy eyes, some red, some yellow, some black, had appeared, embedded into the walls like the remnants of some forgotten nightmare. They stared at her, unblinking and unmoving, their glassy pupils fixed on her with an unearthly intensity. The longer she stared at them, the more unsettling the feeling became. It was as if they were not just watching her, but waiting. She turned her head sharply, trying to pull her focus away, but the eyes were everywhere. They were on the ceiling now too, staring down from their positions like the eyes of some vast, silent creature that watched over her. Her breath hitched as she realized that she wasn't alone in this place anymore. The walls themselves were alive, somehow conscious, somehow aware, and they were watching her. A low, grinding sound reverberated through the floor. Lydia's head snapped toward the source, her pulse quickening as a dark shape began to emerge from the shadows. It was slow, deliberate, dragging itself from the far end of the room, its movements too smooth, too unnatural to belong to anything human. Her heart hammered in her chest as the figure moved closer, its outline becoming clearer in the dim light. It was a shape, a tall, thin silhouette that seemed to bend and stretch unnaturally as it advanced. She couldn't make out any specific details, only the sense of its presence, the suffocating pressure it exerted on the room around her. Her skin prickled, goosebumps rising in waves across her body. Every instinct told her to run, to flee before whatever this thing was could get any closer. But her legs refused to obey. They were numb, unresponsive, as though the very act of moving had been stolen from her. And then, the figure stopped. It was directly in front of her, looming over her like a shadow made flesh. Lydia could barely make out the faintest outlines of its form. A gaping mouth, hollow and dark, but she could not see its eyes. Instead, there was only darkness, deep and consuming, as though the figure's very existence was an absence, a void that threatened to suck the light from the room. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Lydia tried to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. Her throat was tight, as though something was choking her from the inside. She tried to move, but her limbs wouldn't obey. The figure shifted again, slowly, so slowly, that Lydia could only watch in horror as it bent down closer, closer, until its face was mere inches from hers. The stench of decay, rotting flesh and old blood, was overwhelming, so thick that it made her eyes water. And then the thing whispered. It wasn't a sound she could hear, but something she could feel. A pressure inside her mind, cold and wet like the touch of something ancient. The words crawled into her thoughts like insects, burrowing deep into her skull. "Do you see them?" The voice wasn't a voice at all. It was more like a thought, a presence that wrapped itself around her brain, squeezing tightly until she could barely breathe. Lydia tried to scream, to break free from the suffocating grasp of the figure's presence, but her voice was lost in the void. The figure's shape continued to shift, twisting and warping in ways that made her stomach turn. It was no longer a figure at all, but a mass of shifting shadows, a tangled web of limbs and faces that seemed to writhe in the blackness. The eyes in the walls, they were blinking now. The glassy pupils dilated, contracting with a life of their own. They were moving. They were crawling across the walls like insects, swirling and merging together into one endless sea of dark, unblinking eyes. Lydia couldn't breathe. Her chest felt tight, as if the air around her had turned to lead. She tried to move again, her legs shaking violently, but she couldn't stand. The ground beneath her seemed to ripple and shift, as though it was no longer solid but a mass of writhing flesh, pulsating with a sickening rhythm. The sound of scraping echoed in the room. At first, it was faint, distant, like something scratching at the walls. But then, as it grew louder, Lydia realized that it was coming from everywhere. The walls themselves were alive, their surface breaking apart as something tried to claw its way out. Her mind fractured. The darkness around her seemed to tighten, to squeeze every ounce of hope from her chest, and in the suffocating blackness, she couldn't tell if the figure was still there, if the eyes were still watching, or if the asylum itself had begun to consume her. The scratching grew louder still, closer, faster, and then the eyes blinked. But it wasn't the walls that blinked. It was her. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as she realized, with a dawning horror, that she was no longer alone in her mind. Whatever had been watching her, the thing that had taken the shape of the figure, the thing that had whispered to her, was in her head now, burrowing deeper into her thoughts, its fingers spreading out into her consciousness until her very thoughts were no longer her own. The eyes stared back at her, blinking, unblinking, and she knew, with terrible certainty, that it was only a matter of time before they saw everything. Chapter 9. The Eyes in the Dark. The air in the asylum grew colder. Each breath Lydia took seemed to cut through her chest, leaving her lungs frozen. But it wasn't the chill that unnerved her the most. It was the silence. After the terrifying encounter with the figure, the asylum had grown unnaturally still. There were no sounds now, no whispering shadows, no creaks in the floorboards or scurrying of unseen things. The building felt as though it had held its breath, waiting for something. Lydia's eyes flickered to the walls, still crawling with those endless, staring eyes. Their gaze never wavered, but now there was something more unsettling about them. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. She felt it in her bones, deep in the marrow, that they were expecting something. Her perhaps, or the moment when the rest of the asylum would be revealed. She had no idea how much time had passed since the figure had invaded her mind. The line between reality and her own thoughts had blurred until she couldn't trust the things she saw, or even the things she felt. And yet, through it all, there was an undeniable pull. The sense that something crucial, something vital, was just beyond her reach. If she could only push past the suffocating blackness, she would find it. She had to. So, she began to move. Her body protested with every step, every movement feeling as if it were a laborious effort. The air around her was thick, oppressive, and each time she took a step, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, making her feel as though she were walking on unstable ground. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't stand still any longer. Lydia stumbled through the long, narrow corridors, the eyes still watching, still waiting. The stone walls seemed to press in on her, narrowing her path with every turn. The silence, too, seemed to press down on her, an unbearable, suffocating weight. There was something unnatural about it, as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something horrible to happen. Eventually, she came upon a door. It was different from the others, old and rusted, its wood warped and splintered. The hinges were covered in thick, black mold, and the faintest outline of something had been scratched into the door's surface, though Lydia couldn't make out what it was. The door beckoned to her, like a dark promise. Without thinking, she pushed it open. The door creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty hall. She winced at the noise, the silence around her so oppressive that even the smallest disturbance seemed to reverberate through the building. The room beyond the door was dark, almost impenetrable, but Lydia stepped forward, the cold air of the room brushing against her skin like icy fingers. The door closed behind her with a resounding thud. She tried to turn back, but the handle was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. Lydia swallowed hard and turned her gaze to the room. At first, she couldn't make sense of it. The room was small, its walls lined with shelves, each shelf crammed with old, decaying books. The floor was covered in a layer of dust so thick it looked as though no one had set foot in this place for years, maybe even decades. But it wasn't the books that caught her attention. It was the shadows. They moved, not in the natural way that shadows do, swaying with the shifting light, but in the way that living things move, creeping along the walls and the floor, like dark tendrils of some ancient force that refused to stay still. Lydia's eyes widened as she watched the shadows twist and stretch, and it wasn't just the shadows that moved. There were figures, human shapes, dark and indistinct, flickering at the edges of her vision, as though they were trying to escape from the corner of the room, but could never quite free themselves. The air tasted different here. It was heavier, thicker, like something had seeped into the very fabric of the room, something old. Lydia tried to step forward, but the shadows seemed to coil around her feet, like they were pulling her down, holding her in place. And then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw it. In the center of the room, atop a cracked stone pedestal, was a book. Unlike the others, this one was pristine, untouched by time. The cover was dark, almost black, with no title, no markings of any kind, save for a faint shimmer that seemed to move across its surface. The air around it pulsed, and Lydia felt an overwhelming urge to reach for it, to open it, though every instinct in her screamed that she should not. But she could not resist. Her fingers brushed against the cover, and the moment they made contact, the shadows in the room seemed to come alive. They writhed and twisted, pulling away from the walls and the floor, converging on the pedestal. The book trembled under her touch, as though it were alive. The shadows gathered around her, pulling her in, swallowing her whole. They whispered in low, rasping voices, voices that were not her own, voices that seemed to come from everywhere. "It's too late," they whispered. "You shouldn't have opened it." Lydia's heart raced as she pulled her hand back, but the damage was done. The room seemed to warp around her, the walls stretching and bending in ways that defied logic. The shadows grew thicker, coiling around her body, drowning her in darkness. She gasped for air, but it was as though the very atmosphere had been stolen from her, leaving her to suffocate in the crushing weight of the room. And then the voices spoke again. "You're not alone." The shadows twisted, and from the darkness emerged faces. Twisted, contorted faces, some familiar, some not, floating in the air like apparitions. Their eyes were wide, filled with a raw, undying terror, but they said nothing. They didn't need to. Lydia could feel their pain, their fear, their rage, a fury so deep and so ancient that it threatened to consume her. She took a step back, but the room seemed to grow smaller, the shadows closing in on her from all sides. Her breath was ragged, her chest tightening, as though the very air was growing heavier. The faces, those twisted, agonized faces, stared at her, their eyes filled with sorrow and a quiet, terrible knowing. "You shouldn't have opened it," they whispered again, and the shadows closed in. And then, with a jolt, Lydia awoke. Her eyes flew open, her body jerking upright, her hands pressed to the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. But she wasn't in the room with the shadows anymore. She was lying in a different place, a place she didn't recognize. The world around her was dark, cold, and unfamiliar. But the shadows were still there, lurking at the edges of her vision. The book was still with her, its presence like a weight pressing down on her very soul, urging her to read, to understand, to give in. But Lydia knew one thing with certainty now. The asylum was no longer just a place. It was something alive, and it was watching her. Chapter 10. A History Written in Blood. Lydia's pulse quickened as she slowly came to her senses. The weight of the room seemed to linger around her, an oppressive force that made it difficult to breathe. She was no longer in the library-like space, but now sprawled on the cold, unforgiving floor of a hallway. Her surroundings were unfamiliar. Narrow, damp stone walls that stretched endlessly, a thick layer of dust that clung to every surface. There was no warmth here, no signs of life. The air was heavy, laden with something stagnant, as if the very building itself had exhaled a deep, forgotten breath. Her heart raced, and she pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, her head spinning. She felt the lingering weight of the book in her possession, though she could not recall how she had come to hold it in the first place. She glanced at it quickly, almost afraid to, but there it was, dark, still, its cover unchanged, and yet she could feel its presence like a constant pull on her mind. She clutched the book tighter as she stood up, wiping the dust from her hands onto her pants. Her fingers trembled. She took a step forward, but the hallway stretched out before her like a tunnel of darkness. The air seemed to press in on her, urging her to retreat, but there was no going back. The asylum was no longer a place of mere terror. It was a presence. It followed her, pressed in on her, lived within the very walls. The further she moved through its confines, the more she realized that it was no longer merely a physical space. It was part of her soul. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the eerie silence, each one unnaturally loud, reverberating through the hallway like a drumbeat in the night. Every now and then, she would catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned, there was nothing there. Just shadows, endless shadows, stretching and twisting, as though the darkness itself had a life of its own. The shadows weren't the only thing watching her. She felt it. Eyes, those cold, hollow eyes, watching her from the darkness. They weren't visible, but they were there, She could feel them, staring. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as she rounded a corner, stopping dead in her tracks. The hallway in front of her was no longer just stone and dust. There was a door at the end of it, standing out from the rest, though it looked no different from the others. Except it wasn't the door that caught her attention. It was the light, a soft, flickering glow, as if a candle had been placed just beyond the threshold, spilling its dim light into the hallway. She felt an inexplicable pull toward it, a magnetic force urging her forward, drawing her to whatever lay beyond that door. But something about the light, something in the way it flickered and danced, felt wrong. The shadows shifted as if they were moving in time with the glow. They twisted and stretched unnaturally, their tendrils curling toward the door. Lydia's heart pounded in her chest. She hesitated, the fear clawing at her. But the force, the pull toward that light, was stronger than her fear. She stepped forward, one foot after the other, her body moving as if it were no longer entirely hers. As she approached the door, she felt the temperature drop even further. The cold became unbearable, biting at her skin, making her teeth clench. Her breath came out in short, jagged bursts, and the air felt as though it was thickening around her. The flickering light from the crack under the door cast strange, shifting shadows on the walls, and Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting. She reached for the handle, and as her fingers brushed the cool metal, a low hum filled the air. The sound seemed to come from the walls themselves, vibrating in her bones, a sound that echoed deep within her chest. For a moment, the world around her seemed to warp, to shift, like a moment suspended in time. The door creaked open. Lydia stepped inside. The room beyond was smaller than she had expected, but its contents seemed to grow larger with every passing moment. The walls were lined with mirrors, dozens of them, reflecting her image back at her in 1,000 distorted ways. But it wasn't just her reflection that made her heart race. It was the eyes. At first, she thought it was her own eyes she saw staring back at her, wide, frightened, uncertain. But when she looked closer, her breath caught. The eyes were not hers. They were something else, something ancient, something empty. They were hollow eyes, devoid of life, and yet they stared at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Some mirrors reflected faces, their expressions twisted with a grotesque blend of agony and fear, their mouths open in silent screams. Others reflected nothing at all, leaving only the void. Lydia backed away from the nearest mirror, a cold sweat breaking out on her brow. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, thudding louder with each passing second. There was something deeply wrong here. The mirrors weren't just reflecting her. They were absorbing her, drawing her into their depths. She could feel her own image stretching, distorting, as if the mirrors wanted to swallow her whole. Suddenly, the light flickered. It went out. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. Lydia froze, her breath caught in her throat, and the eyes in the mirrors seemed to shift, their hollow gaze now focused directly on her. Then, as her eyes adjusted to the dark, she could make out a shadow, a shape, standing at the far end of the room. Lydia's body went stiff as the figure stepped closer, slowly, as if the darkness itself were guiding its movement. The figure was tall, its form indistinct and blurred, but its eyes, those eyes, stared straight at her, their hollow depths pulling her in. She wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The coldness had seeped into her bones, freezing her in place. Then, the whisper began. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with every passing second, until it was all she could hear. "You should have left. The mirrors. They never forget." Lydia's heart raced, and her breath caught in her throat as the figure moved closer still. She could see it more clearly now. Its face was blurred, its features indistinct, but its eyes, those hollow eyes, seemed to burn into her very soul. In that moment, she understood. The mirrors weren't just reflecting her, they were trapping her. And the eyes that stared back at her weren't her own. They were the eyes of those who had come before her, those who had stepped into this place, thinking they could escape, those who had thought they could leave the asylum behind. But the asylum didn't let them go. Not now, not ever. Lydia turned, and with a surge of panic, she ran. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The sound of her feet pounding against the cold stone floor echoed through the hallway, and the shadows seemed to follow her, pressing in on all sides. She could feel them, those hollow eyes, watching her, waiting for her, knowing she would return. She didn't know how long she ran, or where she was headed. The halls seemed endless, twisting in on themselves, the shadows reaching for her, pulling her back to the place she had just escaped. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. Chapter 11. The Fading Light. Lydia's body was numb as she stumbled through the corridors, her mind a jumbled blur of fear and exhaustion. The walls pressed in tighter around her, narrowing with each step, as though the very building was constricting, squeezing the life out of her. Every corner she turned revealed another identical passage, the same damp stone, the same flickering light overhead. No matter which direction she chose, the path seemed to lead nowhere. It was as if she were moving in circles, trapped in an endless loop, with no way out. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her lungs burning from the effort of running, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't stop. The room with the mirrors, the figure, the eyes, they were still fresh in her mind, haunting her thoughts like a nightmare that refused to fade. She could still feel the pull of the mirrors, the suffocating coldness of the air in that room, and most of all, she could still hear the whisper, the voice that had followed her, echoing through her mind, no matter how far she had run. You should have left. The mirrors, they never forget. The words twisted in her head, an incessant mantra that rattled her senses. What did it mean? What did it want from her? Suddenly, she stumbled over something hard. Her foot hit the edge of a broken tile, sending her sprawling forward. The impact knocked the air from her lungs, and she gasped, her hands scraping against the rough stone as she tried to push herself back up. Her legs trembled, and her vision blurred, but she forced herself to stand, her heart hammering in her chest. She looked around. The hallway before her was different. The walls, once smooth and pristine, were now cracked and peeling, the stone showing signs of decay. She could smell something faintly metallic in the air, something sharp, like blood, and it made her stomach churn. The flickering lights above her sputtered and dimmed, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out and slither along the floor like dark fingers. Her pulse quickened, and then she heard it. At first, it was almost imperceptible, just a whisper beneath the sound of her own ragged breath. But as she strained her ears, the sound became clearer, a faint, high-pitched scream. It was distant at first, like a muffled cry from deep within the bowels of the asylum. But it grew louder with every step she took, the sound reverberating off the walls, surrounding her. The scream was piercing, filled with terror, raw and guttural. It made her stomach twist in horror, and her skin prickled with cold dread. It was a scream for help, a scream of agony. Lydia froze in place, her body trembling. The scream echoed in the empty hall, ringing in her ears, but there was something else, something deeper. It wasn't just a sound, it was alive. The air itself seemed to throb with it, vibrating like a living thing, pulling at her senses. Her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms as she struggled to breathe. She tried to focus, to think, but the scream wouldn't stop. It reverberated inside her skull, growing louder, more desperate, and it seemed to be coming closer, closer and closer. She couldn't tell where it was coming from. The hallway stretched before her like an endless abyss, and with every scream, the shadows seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The floor beneath her feet seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the sound, each scream driving her deeper into a state of panic. She turned in circles, desperate to find the source, but every direction was the same. Endless stone walls, narrow corridors, and flickering lights that barely offered any comfort. The sound of the scream grew louder still, and in the distance, Lydia thought she saw something moving. At first, it was a blur, a shadow that shifted unnaturally. But then, as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw it, a figure. It was a woman, her face twisted in a silent scream, her mouth stretched wide in terror, but no sound came from her lips. Her eyes were empty sockets, dark and hollow, staring straight through Lydia with an expression of pure horror. The figure was dressed in a tattered hospital gown, stained with something dark, blood, perhaps. The woman's body was gaunt, her skin stretched tight over her bones, and as she moved toward Lydia, the air seemed to grow colder. Lydia took a step back, her legs shaky beneath her. The figure did not move like a living being. It was jerky, unnatural, like a puppet with its strings cut. Its limbs jerked in odd angles, and its head swiveled unnervingly as it slowly advanced toward her, its eyes never leaving her. The scream grew louder, more intense, as though it were emanating from the figure itself. The sound was no longer just in her ears. It was in her chest, in her bones, vibrating through her very being. Lydia took another step back, her heart hammering in her chest. But the figure didn't stop. It kept coming, its broken body lurching forward, dragging its feet in an almost dragging manner, as if it were unwilling to approach her, yet inexorably drawn toward her. She could feel her breath becoming shallow, her chest tightening. The figure was almost upon her now, its empty eyes locked onto hers. She couldn't breathe. The scream was deafening, almost unbearable, and the figure's presence, its cold, lifeless eyes, were suffocating. She wanted to run, to escape, but her body refused to obey. Her legs felt like stone, frozen in place, and the air around her thickened with a pressure that crushed her chest. Then, the figure stopped just inches from her. It lifted one trembling hand, its fingers skeletal and pale, and reached toward her with a slow, deliberate motion. The scream echoed louder and louder, shaking the very walls, and Lydia felt as if her soul was being pulled toward the figure, as if it was trying to consume her, to pull her into the abyss with it. Her mind screamed at her to escape, but her body remained paralyzed, her eyes locked with the figure's hollow gaze. And then, as if the asylum itself had decided to put an end to the torment, the scream stopped. Silence fell. The figure stood before her, its hand hovering just inches from Lydia's face. The air around her was still, as though the entire building was holding its breath. Lydia stood frozen, her body trembling, but the figure did not move. For a moment, she thought it might be over. But then, without warning, the figure lunged toward her, its mouth wide open in an eerie, silent scream, its hands reaching for her throat. Lydia stumbled backward, gasping for air, but she couldn't escape. The world around her spun. She was falling. Everything went black. Chapter 12. Voices that drown the silence. Lydia awoke in darkness. For a moment, she thought she was still trapped in the asylum, in the suffocating grip of the figure that had lunged at her. Her eyes snapped open, but there was nothing. No eerie figure, no looming presence, just the thick, oppressive blackness around her. She couldn't feel the cold floor beneath her, nor the dampness that had clung to her skin moments before. It was as if she were suspended in a void that seemed to stretch forever in every direction. Her chest was tight, and she realized she was holding her breath. The panic that had overtaken her in the corridor still clung to her, knotting her insides with fear, but she forced herself to exhale, slow and steady. Her head was throbbing, her pulse still pounding in her ears, but the silence. It was the silence that unnerved her most. There was no sound, no whispering, no distant screams, no flickering lights, just nothing. She strained her ears, hoping to catch any faint noise, any sign that she wasn't alone. The air felt thick, too thick, stale and stagnant, as though it had not been disturbed in years, centuries even. It tasted of decay, and her lungs burned with the effort of trying to breathe it in. Slowly, she pushed herself to sit up. The ground beneath her was soft, almost cushioned, like old, decayed fabric. But it wasn't the familiar stone of the asylum's halls. She placed a hand on it and felt it shift beneath her touch, like old, rotted wood. Her fingers grazed over something rough, stone or bone, perhaps, but it was warm, unsettlingly so, and it seemed to pulse under her hand. She flinched. Suddenly, there was a sound, a soft scraping noise from the far side of the room. A movement, though there was no visible source. Lydia's body froze, instinctively drawing her knees closer to her chest. She wasn't alone. She knew it without seeing anything. A presence, cold and insidious, lingered in the air, like a weight on her chest, suffocating her. The sound came again, only louder this time. A dragging, scraping sound, as if something was slowly crawling across the floor, dragging itself closer to her. Lydia's breath quickened, her pulse racing again as her mind screamed for her to run. But run where? There was no door, no exit, just the endless, suffocating darkness. Then, a whisper. It was faint at first, a barely audible murmur, like a voice coming from deep within the walls. Lydia's heart skipped a beat as she strained to hear it more clearly. It wasn't words, not exactly. More like a breathy sigh, a soft rush of air that seemed to reverberate from all directions at once. Lydia, her name. Her heart lurched in her chest, but it was wrong. The whisper wasn't just in her ears. It was inside her head, threading through her thoughts, curling like smoke inside her skull. And then, suddenly, it was louder, sharper. Lydia, come closer. The words weren't words at all. They were a compulsion, a command, an invisible hand gripping her chest, drawing her forward. The pull was undeniable, like a magnet, a force that she couldn't resist, no matter how hard she tried. Her body moved before her mind had time to catch up, her hands gripping the floor, pushing herself forward. The whisper grew louder still, growing more distinct, and she could hear the urgency in it now. The tone was familiar, almost welcoming, as if it had been waiting for her. It called to her, beckoned her into the depths of the unknown. Come closer, it urged again. And this time Lydia heard the echo of 100 other voices, overlapping, whispering the same words in unison, all pleading with her, all pulling at her soul. There was no question, no choice. She had to follow. But the question gnawed at her. Where was she? How had she gotten here? She stumbled forward, her feet dragging, her body stiff with fear. The ground beneath her was still soft, but now she felt the weight of something more. She felt it before she saw it, a presence. Something in the air, watching her, listening. She was not alone. The darkness was alive. It was watching her every move, waiting. The whispers twisted, changed, becoming more frenetic, more insistent. Lydia's head spun with the weight of them, each voice tearing at her resolve, pulling her deeper into the abyss. Her mind swirled with thoughts, fragmented, broken. Memories of the asylum, of the dark figure with the empty eyes, of the mirrors that had reflected the horror. But this wasn't the same. No, this place was different. The air around her grew colder, biting at her skin as she crawled forward, her hands trembling, her heart racing. She didn't know what she was searching for. She didn't know what awaited her, but she couldn't stop. She didn't have the strength to fight it anymore. The whispers were too powerful, their pull too strong. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she reached the edge of the space she had been crawling toward. The faintest hint of light flickered on the horizon. Far in the distance, just a pinpoint of illumination, barely visible in the black void. It beckoned her, taunted her with the idea of escape. But as she moved closer, the light morphed. It was no longer a warm glow, but a sickly, pulsing radiance, flickering like a candle caught in the wind. It distorted, warped the air around it, twisting into shapes that were not quite human, not quite anything. The figures that surrounded it were blurry, like half-formed ghosts. And then, she saw it. A figure, seated in the center of the light. Its body was skeletal, its skin stretched too tight over its bones. It looked almost human, but it wasn't. It was too still, its head tilted to one side, its eyes hollow pits in its skull, staring directly at her. The whispers grew louder, overwhelming her, drowning her thoughts in a cacophony of desperate, pleading voices. "Join us." Lydia's breath caught in her throat. The figure in the light opened its mouth, and for the first time since her arrival, she could hear its voice, though no sound came from it. It was a scream, but not a sound she could hear. It was felt, a horrible sensation deep in her chest, like the pressure of 1,000 hands closing around her heart. "Join us." Lydia's vision blurred. Her head swam, and her body was pulled forward against her will. She felt herself falling, slipping, the darkness consuming her as the figure's hollow eyes burned into her soul. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. The light surrounded her, engulfing her in its terrible embrace. And then, silence. Chapter 13. The Warden's Secret. Lydia's eyes opened, but the world she saw was unfamiliar. Her body felt heavy, like lead, her skin slick with sweat, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had no memory of how long she had been lying there, but she could feel the cold creeping into her bones, a chill that threatened to freeze her from the inside out. She tried to move, but her limbs felt sluggish, uncooperative. There was no light, no warmth, just a cold, all-encompassing void, like the last breath of a dying world. Her chest constricted as panic gripped her heart once again. She couldn't remember how she had ended up here, in this place. She couldn't remember how she had escaped the figure, the whispers, or the light. The overwhelming urge to run, to escape, rose up in her throat, but there was nowhere to go, no direction to turn. The darkness stretched on endlessly, an oppressive weight pressing down on her every sense, muffling her thoughts. Her body felt like it had been dragged through miles of ice-cold mud, each movement a struggle against the unseen force that seemed to hold her in place. She tried to sit up, but the weight in her chest made it feel like she was drowning. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her vision swirling as the world spun wildly around her. A sound broke the silence, distant, like a low moan, a groan of something old, something ancient. It was faint, barely audible, but it sent a jolt of fear down her spine. Her mind immediately screamed, "Run? Run now." But where? Where could she go? She was no longer in the asylum. She was no longer in the darkness that had once felt so familiar. This place was different. The air was thick, dense, as though the very atmosphere was made of sorrow, of something long forgotten. She could taste the decay, could feel the weight of the past pressing in on her from all sides. The moaning sound grew louder, a guttural rasp that seemed to echo through the void, pulling her attention toward it. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a being, something that existed within the very fabric of this place, something that lurked in the silence. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs, her hands trembling as she pushed herself to her feet, forcing her body to move despite the overwhelming weakness that threatened to take over. As she stood, the ground beneath her shifted, as if the earth itself were breathing. It was subtle at first, just a slight tremor, but it grew more pronounced with each passing second, like the thudding of a monstrous heartbeat. The moaning grew louder, closer, more distinct. It wasn't one voice now, it was many, hundreds, thousands, all layered on top of each other, crying out in agony. Their voices mixed and mingled, becoming a horrible chorus of despair that seemed to rattle the very core of her being. She staggered forward, her movements slow, deliberate. She didn't know why she was walking toward the sound, but some force beyond her control was guiding her, pulling her like a marionette on invisible strings. The darkness began to lift, just slightly, enough to reveal shapes in the distance. They were not solid shapes, not physical things. They were shadows, thick, swirling shadows that twisted and writhed in unnatural ways. The shadows stretched across the floor, reaching out like hands, fingers that beckoned her forward. A sudden wave of nausea overtook Lydia, and she doubled over, gasping for air. She could feel the heat of something close, something watching her, but it was not a presence she could see. It was a feeling, a pressure on her chest, a weight that made her feel small, insignificant, like an insect trapped beneath the gaze of an unfeeling predator. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breath. The moment her lids shut, the whispers came again. Not the soft, beckoning whispers of before. No, these whispers were harsh, cruel, distorted. They echoed through her mind like 1,000 disembodied voices, all speaking at once, overlapping, twisting her thoughts into something unrecognizable. You should not have come. The words were not spoken. They were her thoughts, her very own mind turned against her. They were a command, a warning, a judgment. The voices rose in volume, their tones sharp and agonizing, as if something terrible was about to happen. Lydia's heart pounded harder, each beat a drum of inevitability. You should not have escaped. The air around her thickened, growing dense with every passing second. The shadows at the edge of her vision began to move more quickly, closing in, tightening their grip around her. The temperature dropped, her breath coming out in clouds of mist. She had no idea how long she had been walking, but now she could see it. The source of the moaning. It was not a figure. It was not a person. It was something worse. A mass of shifting shadows, a writhing, twisting mass that seemed to stretch infinitely, as though it were both everywhere and nowhere. Its form was indistinct, like a mass of dark tendrils, stretching in every direction, seeking to consume anything that came too close. It was the source of the sound, the presence that had been haunting her, the thing that had been following her since the moment she first entered the asylum. As Lydia approached, she felt her legs give way, the weight of the presence overwhelming her. She fell to her knees, the cold floor pressing against her skin, her hands gripping the ground as if to keep herself from being sucked into the mass of darkness before her. The mass, the thing before her, seemed to pulse, to breathe, its shadows undulating with the rhythm of some ancient, unholy force. Its whispers grew louder still, now individual voices, each one distinct yet incomprehensible. She reached out, not knowing why. The whispers had become too much, the weight in her chest too heavy. It was like a hand pressing down on her soul, drawing her toward the heart of the darkness. A voice, though not a voice, filled her mind again, whispering, join us." It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't even a command. It was a sentence, a verdict. She felt herself sinking into the cold, felt her body growing heavier, sinking into the floor as if she were being absorbed into the very earth itself. The shadows converged around her, a flood of darkness that covered her completely. The air was thick with the taste of decay, of death, of things lost and forgotten. And then, silence. The moaning stopped. The whispers stopped. The presence that had clung to her like a second skin vanished. Lydia's mind swirled with confusion, her body trembling as if she were on the cusp of waking from a nightmare. But there was no waking. There was only the darkness, only the stillness. And with it came the final truth. There was no escape. Chapter 14. The Return of the Lost Souls. The silence that enveloped Lydia felt suffocating. A silence so profound it pressed down on her chest like the weight of the world. She could no longer hear her breath, could no longer feel the beating of her heart. Nothing but the oppressive stillness surrounding her, consuming her. Her mind, fractured and distant, struggled to grasp what had happened. The shadows had swallowed her whole, pulled her into a dark abyss where time no longer existed, where even her thoughts felt foreign to her. She wanted to scream, to cry out, but her voice had been stolen, lost in the very air she breathed. Lydia tried to move, to claw her way out of the immensity of the nothingness, but her body no longer responded. Every part of her felt numb, as if the darkness itself had seeped into her, had hollowed her out from the inside. Her arms and legs were heavy, each movement a laborious act against a force she could not comprehend. She was trapped, suspended in a place that existed outside of reality, caught between what was and what had never been. And then there it was, a faint flicker, a glimmer of light in the distance. It was weak at first, nothing more than a soft glow in the overwhelming darkness, but it was enough to ignite the spark of hope that had long since dimmed in her heart. Lydia's breath caught in her throat, and without thinking, she reached out, her fingers trembling as they strained toward the light. But the further she reached, the more the light seemed to recede. It taunted her, flickering just beyond her grasp, a beacon in the dark that beckoned her forward. She was drawn to it, pulled like a moth to a flame, though she had no idea what awaited her on the other side. Her legs, slow and unwilling to obey, carried her in the direction of the light. Each step felt like an eternity, each movement a battle against the suffocating weight of the air around her. She was aware now, more than ever, that this light was not just a source of hope. It was something far darker, far more dangerous. It was a lie, a cruel trick, like the promise of salvation that turned to ash the moment it was touched. As she stumbled forward, the light grew stronger, its edges sharp and blinding. The shadows seemed to recoil from it, as if they feared its power. The air grew warmer, though not by much, and she could feel the tingling sensation of life returning to her limbs, if only faintly. But then the light began to shift. It no longer seemed like a welcoming presence. The soft glow became jagged, fractured, like shattered glass reflecting a broken truth. The closer Lydia came, the more the light twisted and contorted, morphing into shapes that were both familiar and foreign. She could see figures moving within it, shadows of people, of memories, distorted and half-formed, like the remnants of lives long forgotten. Lydia stopped. Something in her gut told her that this was not where she was meant to go. This was not an escape. It was a trap, a snare that had been waiting for her all along. The figures in the light moved closer, their forms shifting with unnatural speed. They surrounded her now, an impenetrable circle of flickering shapes, closing in from every direction. Their faces, if they could even be called faces, were twisted, their features constantly shifting, as though they were in the process of being made and unmade at the same time. Lydia's pulse quickened. She tried to move, to back away from the figures, but her legs refused to obey. The light, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a prison, trapping her within its sickening glow. The whispers returned, louder now, a chorus of voices she could not understand, their words clashing against each other as if they were fighting to be heard. "You are nothing. You will never escape. You belong to us now." The voices tore through her mind, their words like daggers, cutting deep into her very soul. She clutched her head, trying to block them out, but the sound was deafening. It was everywhere, inescapable. The figures moved closer still, their forms merging with the light, their limbs becoming tendrils that reached out toward her. Lydia gasped, her chest tightening as she fought against the pressure building around her. The shadows, the whispers, the darkness, they were all converging now, closing in on her in a way that left her breathless. And then, in the midst of it all, something strange happened. A voice broke through the cacophony of sound. It was soft at first, like a whisper, but it carried with it a weight of familiarity, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to echo from somewhere far off, from somewhere she had known long ago. Lydia, her name. It was a voice she hadn't heard in so long. The warmth of it reached into her chest, a sharp contrast to the cold, twisted presence that surrounded her. It was a voice she had almost forgotten, one that once meant safety, once meant love. Her mother. The name came to her like a lifeline, a reminder of who she was, who she had been. She could see her mother's face in her mind, her soft, loving eyes, the way she used to smile when she held Lydia in her arms. That warmth, that love, it was all she had left. For a moment, the light flickered again, and Lydia saw it. Just a glimpse of her mother standing in the distance, her arms open, her face serene, beckoning her to come. But the vision was fleeting, lost as quickly as it had come. The darkness swallowed it whole, taking the image of her mother with it, leaving Lydia alone again in the void. Lydia collapsed to the ground, her hands pressed against the cold, hard floor, her fingers digging into the surface as she gasped for air. The whispers continued, relentless. But now there was something else, something deeper, something more ancient. A rumble, a sound like a heartbeat, but louder, more deafening. It came from the ground beneath her, from the very walls around her. The air grew thick, the weight of it crushing, suffocating. "You cannot leave." The words boomed in her ears, and for the first time since the darkness had claimed her, Lydia understood. She understood the truth that had been hidden from her all along. She was never meant to leave. She was never meant to escape. The asylum, this place, had claimed her long ago. It had been waiting for her, watching her every move, keeping her trapped in its endless cycle of shadows and whispers. She had been its prisoner from the moment she set foot inside, and now there would be no more hope. Lydia's breath slowed, her body succumbing to the weight of the truth. The shadows, the figures, the whispers, they were not just a part of this place. They were the place. They were its very soul, its essence. And now, she was a part of it, woven into the very fabric of the asylum that had consumed everything in its path. Her heart beat once more, slower now, her eyes closing as the darkness enveloped her. And in that final moment, Lydia understood. She had never been alone. Chapter 15. Beyond the Threshold of Madness. The world, if it could even be called that now, had shifted. The lines between reality and nightmare had dissolved, leaving Lydia adrift in an eternal, unbroken echo. She no longer felt the ground beneath her, nor the air that once filled her lungs. There was only the heavy hum of silence, the kind that pressed in from all sides, suffocating her thoughts, stealing her breath, and making her wonder if she had ever existed outside of this place. The darkness around her was no longer an unfamiliar enemy. It had become a part of her. It had claimed her in ways she couldn't fully understand, weaving itself into her being, into her memories, her flesh, and her soul. And she had accepted it. But something had changed. For the first time since she had crossed the threshold of the asylum, she felt an overwhelming sense of awareness. It was as if the darkness had unlocked something deep within her, a dormant power, an ancient force that had been buried and forgotten. A voice, not the cruel whispers she had heard before, but a voice with purpose, surged through her mind. "You are the last." The words reverberated, echoing in the void that stretched on endlessly before her. She didn't understand them at first, but then, like an unholy revelation, the truth crept in. She was the last soul to walk these forsaken halls. The last one who would ever know the asylum's true hunger, its endless thirst for new blood. And she had been chosen. The air thickened around her, dense with the presence of something vast, something ancient. She could feel its eyes on her, the collective gaze of the forgotten souls that had once walked the very path she now tread. They were watching her, waiting for her, and they were not content with simply her presence. They wanted her to become one of them. They wanted her to fill the void, to add her essence to their everlasting prison. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. She understood now. The asylum was not just a place of torment. It was a vessel, an organism, alive with the energy of the lost and the damned. It consumed those who wandered into its depths, twisted them, and bound them to its endless, cyclical horror. But now, it sought something more. It sought permanence. It sought to reach beyond its decaying walls, to break free from the darkness that confined it. And she was the key. The thought made her tremble. The weight of the knowledge was almost unbearable. She had spent what felt like an eternity in this place, yet it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The asylum would continue, feeding on the memories, the suffering, the souls of those unlucky enough to cross its path, forever and ever, until the very earth itself crumbled away. But there was still one thing that lingered in the back of her mind, a question she had never dared to ask until now. Where was everyone else? Her footsteps, once slow and heavy, faltered as she moved through the cold, familiar halls. Her mind, twisted by the asylum's relentless grip, sought the answers in the faces of the shadows that flitted along the walls, always just out of reach. She thought she could hear their cries, their mournful whispers, but when she turned, they vanished like smoke in the wind. There were no more victims left to claim. Her footsteps quickened as the familiar corridors twisted into unfamiliar shapes, leading her deeper into the heart of the asylum. She knew it now. The heart of the asylum was not a place of stone or iron. It was a presence, an entity that filled every corner, every breathless space, like a suffocating fog. Its power thrived in the very air she breathed, and now, as she ventured farther, she could feel it pulsing. The very walls seemed to hum with its heartbeat. "It is time," the voice whispered, soft and relentless. Lydia's chest tightened. She could see it now. There, in the distance, at the end of the long, winding hallway, stood the very thing that had first drawn her here, the very thing that had begun her journey into this madness. The door. It was the same door that had beckoned her before, the one that now stood ajar, as though inviting her in. The air around it shimmered with an unnatural glow, like the ripples of a dream, a vision half formed and half forgotten. Her feet moved of their own accord, drawn toward it, as if she had no say in the matter. She couldn't stop herself, even if she wanted to. She had to enter. She had to. Lydia reached for the door, her hand trembling. It felt cold to the touch, colder than anything she had ever known. She pushed it open, her heart thundering in her chest. Inside was not a room, not a space, but an infinite darkness, a vast, yawning abyss that stretched out before her, devouring all sense of distance, all sense of reality. There were no walls, no floors, no boundaries, just an endless void, a chasm that seemed to swallow everything, even her thoughts. And there, in the center of the void, stood a figure. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as the figure turned toward her, its form impossibly tall, impossibly slender. It was a silhouette, a shadow within the shadow, its features hidden beneath a cloak of darkness. It moved toward her with unnatural speed, its body bending and twisting in ways that defied all logic. Her body froze, her heart hammering as it approached. The figure reached out, its hand long and skeletal, its fingers impossibly elongated. It touched her face gently, and the instant it did, Lydia's vision exploded with light. She screamed, not with her mouth, for she couldn't scream, but with her soul, her very essence tearing apart. The force of the light ripped through her, burning away the darkness that had clung to her for so long, exposing the raw, jagged edges of her being. And in that moment, Lydia understood. The asylum was not just a prison. It was the door to something far greater. The souls it had trapped, the suffering it had fed on, had all been part of a far larger design. This place was a threshold, a way station between this world and something far more terrifying, more powerful than anything she had ever known. The figure before her, the entity in the heart of the void, it was the gatekeeper. And now, she was its final offering. The darkness folded in around her, enclosing her like a suffocating shroud. The asylum, its endless corridors, its echoing whispers, they were gone, erased, wiped from existence as if they had never been. Lydia stood in the void, her form no longer her own, no longer a thing of flesh and blood, but a part of the eternal nothingness. Her mind was no longer her own. It had become one with the darkness. She had crossed the threshold, and now she was the keeper of the forgotten. She was part of the echo, part of the unending scream that would haunt the world for all eternity. The last breath of the forgotten had been taken, and Lydia was its final, hollow echo.